Good afternoon, all. I'd like to welcome you to the Yuwaya Ngarra-li webinar on understanding food and water insecurity in Walgett and building community-led solutions. I'm joining today from Bidjigal country, and I pay respects to elders past and present here and to the traditional owners of the country that you're all joining from, colleagues here at UNSW and elsewhere. And in particular, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present in Walgett on Gamilaroi country. Thanks for joining us today. For those of you I don't already know, Ruth McCausland. I'm the director of the UNSW side of the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership with the Dharriwaa Elders Group in Walgett. We started this webinar series for UNSW colleagues primarily as a way to talk about various aspects of our work, and we've increasingly had interest from colleagues outside UNSW, and we have a number of you joining us today. So for context, for those who aren't already familiar with our work, the Yuwaya Ngarra-li, which means vision in Gamilaroi language, our partnership really grew from collaboration on a research study from 2011 to 2015. And myself and other criminology academics at UNSW were looking into the criminalisation of Aboriginal people with mental health issues and cognitive disability. And we had a large qualitative study as part of that research, where we partnered with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations in different sites, in different communities. One of those sites was Walgett, and we worked very closely there with the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service and the Dharriwaa Elders Group, who'd long had concerns about Aboriginal people in their community ending up in contact with the criminal justice system. And so when we went to report back on that research, we had a number of recommendations. Many of them were systemic. And a big focus was, as we've been hearing from many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders for many years, that what we need is resourcing for community-led solutions. And this was certainly a very strong finding of that research. And we'd heard it loud and clear from many Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and partners. And so that really started a conversation which led to an invitation from the Dharriwaa Elders Group to the university as a whole to work with them longer term, not just around criminal justice issues, but a whole range of issues that they were facing challenges around and had grappled with working with government and others on over many years, and really felt like the university could make a difference. So from our perspective, it was an incredible privilege to be able to collaborate in this way. And since then, we've built this long-term partnership working on a range of issues, including housing, caring for country, and this work that we're talking about today around food and water security. So food and water insecurity is a major area of concern for the Walgett community. Probably most of you have heard particularly about the drinking water in recent weeks. But the Elders Group and the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service have been working to improve access, not just to safe drinking water, but to fresh, quality, nutritious food locally, and many other areas relevant to this question. So in 2018, the Elders Group requested those at the university to assist with the testing of Walgett's drinking water. So community concerns about the quality of their water were high after the switch from the local town water being from river water to bore water sourced from the Great Artesian Basin. And we found Professor Jackie Webster as part of the search for the right person to help us look in detail at the quality of Walgett's drinking water. Jackie Webster at the George Institute for Global Health, who would be joining us today, except she's on long service leave, and last we heard she was climbing a mountain in Morocco, actually on a bike, not climbing it, but I don't know if that is more or less impressive. Jackie's not here, but she was a very key person involved in this work, along with a number of engineering colleagues testing Walgett's water. And what we found is that the water was incredibly high in sodium, which is particular concern for people living with chronic disease, of which many people in the Walgett community are. So advocacy by the Elders Group at that time saw significant media coverage in the lead up to the last state election, leading to the New South Wales government committing to installing a reverse osmosis system in Walgett and also in Burke at that time. However, you won't be surprised to hear that wasn't the end of the story, and you'll hear more about today what's happened with both that system and the quality of Walgett's drinking water. In 2019, we held a food forum at Walgett High School in which we really brought to discussion with those super engaged at the Walgett end on these questions, the data and research about what's known about food issues relevant to Aboriginal people in Walgett and the impacts on long-term health and wellbeing. We also sought to gather all of those interested stakeholders at the Walgett end together, critical services, organisations and others, to discuss the history of issues around food and water in Walgett, and also to start to develop some strategies and evidence-based solutions to what the community was facing. So at that time were representatives of local Aboriginal community controlled organisations, often referred to as ACCHOs, local Shire Council staff, teachers and others from the school, food retailers, including the local IGA, who are really actively involved in this work with the Elders Group and the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service, other concerned local residents. And we really discussed issues around food supply, drinking water quality, but also growing food locally and options for that, and the effect of food choices on physical and mental health. Now, for those who are interested, the report of that forum can be found on the Dharriwaa Elders Group or our website at the UNSW end on Yuwaya Ngarra-li, and includes many of the suggestions and community perspectives raised through the forum. And so building on the food forum, there was a number of strategies led locally that became known as the Food and Water for Life program. And that has a broader long-term aim to address the kinds of issues raised at the food forum and to kind of build the solutions, again, led locally. So the value and urgency of this work was really highlighted after Walgett's only supermarket burnt down in 2019, but also many local food shortages during COVID, where that was a real concern locally. Now, a contribution I just want to briefly mention here is a number of UNSW engineering staff and students who collaborated with the Elders Group and the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service on the community garden. They're developing irrigation solutions and shade for the community garden, which was relaunched in late 2020. There was a number of staff and students joining today. I think Niall Earl is here also, who was involved with that work, and Greg Leslie was a key person who you'll hear from later around this. So through the Food and Water for Life program, we've been working to enable community-led and sustainable food and water initiatives that are run locally in Walgett, employ local Aboriginal people, and ensure healthy drinking water and fresh, nutritious food produced locally for many years to come. There's a lot of interest in this as a model and a program in other communities, as you can imagine. And so this work was received a significant boost through an NHMRC grant for 5 years that we're partway through. And the survey results that we're discussing today were really about better understanding the experiences of food and water insecurity in Walgett through community surveys as a kind of baseline that we'll be able to measure over time. And so that's the results of that is what we're discussing today. You'll be hearing today from some really key people involved in that work. First, we're going to play a short clip from a recent episode of The Drum that features the extraordinary Virginia Robinson, who many of you will know of, who's secretary of the Dharriwaa Elders Group. And it includes some footage that was shot by ABC 730 in Walgett in March. I'll then introduce you to our esteemed panel who discuss the Food and Water Security Survey methodology and findings. And interspersed with that, you'll hear via video from our key Food and Water for Life colleagues from the Dharriwaa Elders Group and the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service, Trish Tonkin and Annie Dean. And we'll also conclude by talking about some of the community-led initiatives and next steps being developed as part of the Food and Water for Life program. Now, as you can hear, we've got an action-packed agenda, so we may not have time for many extra questions. If you have anything burning you would like to ask, please put it in the chat. I'll try and get to them. The wonderful Izzy Burton-Clark is assisting us with the logistics today, and they'll be monitoring the chat, but we'll also, I'll hand to them now to play the video from The Drum featuring Virginia Robinson. Thanks, Izzy.
Well, it's been called the town where soft drink runs more freely than water. In Walgett, about 3 hours drive north of here, tap water is undrinkable. Rivers have run dry and the groundwater the town now relies on has very high levels of the chemical sodium, with desalination efforts failing. And with a large Indigenous population, many with chronic health conditions, it poses serious health risks. The state's new Water Minister, Rose Jackson, will visit Walgett tomorrow, where residents are frustrated by the lack of action. Virginia Robinson from the Dharriwaa Elders Group spoke to the Drum's Jason Whitaker.
Walgett is situated northwestern New South Wales outback. Walgett itself has a large Aboriginal population and it's rising. Well, visibly, you could see that it just wasn't clear water. It was very dirty, very muddy, and sometimes there were fish floating along the Bowen River, and then the river just dried up completely. We're worried that our community, which has many people with long-term health problems, should not be drinking water that is so high in sodium, and that is 15 times the level considered safe by doctors. Families in this community that very little, tiny little incomes began paying, up to $50 a week on bottled water. That's weekly, and sometimes every day of a week.
How much? $41.85.
The action we want is that the Aboriginal community-controlled organisations in Walgett, the ACCHOs, appeal to the New South Wales government to bring a new initiative to provide healthy, clean drinking water to our town. We are waiting for this new government now to have the courage and commitment to do something about this. Action is overdue. This wouldn't be tolerated in Sydney, so why is it okay here?
Meanwhile, the federal government today announced a pathway.
Incredibly powerful insights there from Virginia Robinson, and a snapshot, I suppose, of the strength and the determination of the community in Walgett to challenge government to listen and to act on the issues that they've been advocating around for many years. So since this video screened, there have been some announcements relating to Walgett's drinking water from the new New South Wales Minister for Water, Rose Jackson, and we'll hear more a bit about that later. But I would now like to introduce our really fabulous panel. We've got Kezia Bennett-Brooke, Professor Greg Leslie and Alinta Trindle, who are all involved as investigators and researchers in the Food and Water for Life program. And rather than read their very long and impressive bios, which you can always look up yourselves, I thought it might be nice to ask them to introduce themselves, but in particular in the context of how they began working with the Elders Group and the Walgett community and Yuwaya Ngarra-li. Kez, can we start with you?
Thanks, Ruth. I was about to thank you for not reading out my bio. There's nothing more embarrassing than sitting through that. Yeah, thank you. I would just like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Dharriwaa country and also pay my respects to elders past and present. Yeah, I'm Kezia Bennett-Brooke. I'm a Torres Strait Islander woman, born and raised on Dharriwaa country where I'm joining today. And I'm program head of Gunumana at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research Program at the George Institute. And I was first involved with this project. I'm just trying to remember exactly the first time that I went out to Walgett. I believe it was in 2018, 2019, perhaps. And yeah, really privileged to be a part of the inception of this kind of Food and Water for Life project from there, and to be introduced to the amazing community there, both through the Dharriwaa Elders Group and WAMS, the local Aboriginal Medical Service as well. So yeah, I'll stop there for introducing myself. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks so much, Kez. Greg, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks everyone for giving up your time today to listen to this presentation. We appreciate that. I, like Ruth, I'm on Digital country here in Kensington, and I pay my respects to Aboriginals past and present and acknowledge that the land has never been ceded. And there's nothing more important than giving First Nations people a voice in our constitution. I'm the director of UNSW's Global Water Institute. It's an umbrella organisation that tries to coordinate activities across 12 water-related research centres in 5 different faculties at UNSW, and we have a lot of people that are active in marine, freshwater and urban water systems. And so I was privileged, or be given the privileged position of being the point of coordination between the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership and the Dharriwaa Elders. I had the opportunity to visit Walgett for the first time. I think it was the end of 2017. I remember it was summer. And what struck me on that occasion was the conviction and the direction that the community was able to provide. It became very clear from the start that we needed to sort of step outside of our silos. I'm a chemical engineer that has worked a lot with membrane systems in different parts of the world, but not only membranes, in other areas of water and wastewater, and we tend to be very siloed. And what was immediately apparent was that you can't disconnect water from other aspects of life there, and that grew into the it didn't grow, but it built the momentum from the various programs that the community were thinking of. The criminal youth justice diversion work, the housing, the transport, everything that affects them is related. And it's about possession, it's about self-determination, and it's about their own capacity. So it was really, in hindsight, even though at the beginning we didn't quite know exactly how we fit, was in hindsight, it was quite easy to get behind what the community wanted to do. And our privilege as a university, we have connections to the George Institute, we have connections to the School of Photovoltaics and Renewable Energy. We were able to provide advice on things like floodplain harvesting from our brilliant experts in the Faculty of Law, as well as scientists and engineers and human geographers that are all involved. So that's been, I think, the most rewarding part of this work. Today we're going to talk about the really sobering news coming from it and why we have to take action, but I'll leave that to the second part of it today.
Thanks so much, Greg. Alinta.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm Alinta Trindle. I am a Whangarei Gamilaroi woman. I am joining from digital country, so I'll acknowledge that the elders past and present. Yes, I'm a research assistant. I have two roles. I work at the George Institute with Kez in the Gurumana team, and I work at Yuwaya Ngarra-li in the Two Rivers Pathway to Change project around youth justice. And I first came into contact with the Walgett Mob and DEG when I started working on the Food and Water for Life project.
Thanks so much, Alinta, and really looking forward to hearing more from you a bit later around your experience of being involved in the survey team in Walgett, which was a really, really interesting process, I think, for everyone involved. We'll also hear from Trish and Annie about their experience on the survey team as well. But I'd like to now go to ask some questions of you all around the sort of methodology, the approach of this particular survey. Kez, I would love to hear from you first. If you talk to us a little bit about the importance, I suppose, of Aboriginal community-led research, across the board in matters affecting First Nations communities, but I guess particularly around this issue. And I know your team at the George Institute work across a lot of areas, but specifically the value of community-led research.
Sure, yeah. So I think community-led research is obviously vital, I would say, with any research that involves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but particularly in the context of this project as well, for many reasons. And I think firstly, that's really around ensuring respect for Indigenous knowledge systems. And, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we do have our own distinct knowledge systems and worldviews and cultural practices that really differ from Western ways of knowing. And I think research is often really grounded in those Western ways of knowing. And so that's a really critical element of doing community-led research. As many of us will know that research can and has caused harm, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, by whether by exploiting or excluding or very often misrepresenting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and knowledges as well. And, you know, as I said, we've seen that research is often really situated in that Western paradigm of evidence generation that historically hasn't always benefited Aboriginal communities. So I think community-led research really flips that and prioritises the inclusion and respect of Aboriginal knowledges, and is really makes sure that research is grounded in communities' values and perspectives. And, you know, in the context of this work, ensuring that local community members and organisations have been directly involved in the research really means that we can explore appropriately, you know, questions around what do we actually mean by food and water security, and actually ask questions that are relevant to the community. And so, you know, of course, we know that it's about access to safe, affordable and nutritious food and water, but I think more than this, it's about that understanding of the importance of food and water sovereignty and their interconnectedness for First Nations peoples. And, you know, Walgett mob rather are river people, and, you know, connection to and care for country is absolutely critical to the health and well-being of the community. And I think that term country isn't always well understood, and, you know, for First Nations people it's not so easily defined, and really encompasses you know, not just the lands and waterways that we're connected to, but it's much more than this. It's really about our connection to place and custom and language, culture, in this case as well, sustenance and family, and really identity is such a big part of that as well. And so I think those kinds of nuances are really critical in this kind of research, and really come through in feedback that we've heard from the community. I think if I'm speaking really frankly, sometimes the terms, I think, co-design or community research have often been co-opted when people mean that they've kind of only barely scratched the surface in terms of engaging with communities, and sometimes aren't really going beyond tokenism. But I think true Aboriginal community-led research includes community members in the entire research process, from the inception right through to any data collection, analysis, and really importantly, translating those findings, not just for the scientific community, but back to First Nations communities. And I think that's been such a real strength of this project and a real grounding for this project. So yeah, I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kez. That's such a wonderful answer and response with so much nuance to it. I'm really interested in your thoughts about, you know, from a methodological perspective, as you say, that question of doing harm is one. You know, we know that the Elders Group induction, there's always that focus on do no harm, because we know that research has been a done to kind of process for so long for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And one of the things, I suppose, is there's often a debate around, is there some methodologies that are better than others? So often qualitative methodologies are seen as perhaps, you know, giving more room for voice and for perspective and storytelling from the perspective of community members and others. This survey, I guess, used, you know, international kind of tools and standardized questions. And so it's a kind of methodology that's often seen as quite problematic, perhaps, in this area. I'm interested in your perspective on you know, the role of this kind of survey in community aspirations for change.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's something that does often come up from whether it's concerns from researchers wanting to work in this space, and, you know, trying to grapple with that understanding of how to approach a study or work with multiple methods, you know, quant, qual, or you know, we often talk about, rather than mixed methods, which is quite a well understood term, we talk about using multiple methods, and often the work that we do is at that research interface of Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems. And I think there's a space of growth and you know, innovation when those knowledge systems can come together and be complementary and respectful of one another. And I think that's what we've seen here in the use of a tool that might be grounded in Western science, but we're approaching this whole study with a really decolonizing lens in the way that we are working. And, you know, I think coming back to that idea around community-led research, it actually increases research quality because, you know, we're more likely to produce relevant, accurate and culturally appropriate research outcomes when we're drawing on the community's knowledge and experiences and coupling that with, you know, other research methods as well. And I think that's where we can get to that point of research that is of really true benefit for communities.
Thanks so much, Kez. Greg, can I ask you to talk a bit more about the survey tools that were used in this study and how they were adapted, you know, for use in Walgett, but also, I guess, as part of that, why it's important to use internationally validated tools like those used for this survey.
Well, so the two tools that were used were the Food Insecurity Index survey and the Water Insecurity survey. The food survey is centered around 9 questions. The food one was around 9. The water one was around 12 questions. They were developed by a group of researchers in the US, principally located at Northwestern University, although there was inputs from Arizona State. And really, they were designed, particularly the one that I can, as a water nerd, the one I can speak to with most clarity was they were designed because, to use Kez's phrase, the Western view of having a list of analytes that make up our Australian drinking water guidelines or the US EPA regulations, you know, is a really reductive way of looking at the quality of water and how that quality relates to someone's experience that influences whether they feel secure or not in their water supply. There's a great analogy that the food industry moved away from the simple measure of calories. They know that each calorie is not the same and that we have this, you know, the food pyramid. The Water Insecurity Index really addresses the overall and a very holistic way, is this water, am I secure in this space with this amount, with this type of water? And that's a real basic need. And another example of I think why it was so powerful in this particular case was because it allowed us to bring in all the other elements that are connected to land, that are connected to country, that you would miss. And so from a very Western viewpoint, you'd say, look, and we get this from the health department. The water that people drink in Walgett meets the Australian drinking water guidelines, the end. But if you talk to the people in Walgett, if you run this survey, you find that it isn't meeting their needs. Now, put aside the issue of people that are being prescribed medication to deal with hypertension, and the medicos there would say, look, if you're on those drugs, you really shouldn't be drinking water that has sodium levels north of 20 milligrams per litre. Well, we know that they have close to 300 milligrams per litre when they're on bore water in Walgett. But it's the other pressures that are on that community as well. They've seen the rivers run dry. In fact, the progressively, as we went up there from 2017 through to about the end of 2019, where the Barwon meets the Namoi, it got progressively drier and drier to the point where you could almost walk across that point there. So what's happening upstream is affecting their sense of security in their water supply. And all of those things came out at a real, and I didn't participate in the surveys, but I've heard from people that did that it was really confronting. It was quite emotional, particularly where people are expressing that they felt shame about not having confidence to wash their clothes in the water and presenting themselves to the public, or not being confident in cooking food in that water because of the way it began to taste and how the food began to change. So all of that goes beyond the very simple numbers that we use to say, look, this water meets the standards, this doesn't. So that's why it was so powerful. It gave a voice to that part of people's lives.
Thanks so much, Greg. Yeah, that's a wonderful take on that. Could you briefly talk a little bit about, Sarah Young's work, because she
Sure.
launched this work and
Yeah.
her visit from Northwestern Union and the really interesting perspective she brought on the value of this kind of tool internationally, particularly around accountability.
Yeah, sorry, Ruth, that was
Sorry?
exam 101. Read the question, Greg. Answer part B. Part B is that in putting the NH and MRC grant together a few years ago, we looked at the tools that were developed by Sarah Lewis Young, and they were chosen specifically because they had been run out in a number of countries and in a number of communities. So there was a solid database to compare against. In addition, because the questions can be quite standardized, they are able to sample really large populations through companies like Gallup, where they can look at, are you experiencing any insecurity with your water? And typically a score of less than 12 on that scale indicates that there's really no issue with the water, because you're answering one, which is usually there isn't an issue. So in developed countries, you see that people feel very privileged about their water supply, whereas then when you drill into the individual communities within there, and it's usually an issue of privilege. Regrettably, it's a lot of Indigenous communities that feel this way, particularly in Canada and parts of South America, and all around the world where the tool is being used. You begin to see that no, the water is not as good as we think it is. Now that's the other, so that's one strength, that we've got this international benchmark. The second strength that it's got is that doesn't need to be the end of the conversation. And in Sarah's experience, communities where they have scored poorly at the beginning, you begin to have this dialogue that we're having now. And then when the survey is repeated, as a result of those actions, those programs, the score improves. So it's a really important way of connecting and seeing and bringing the community on the journey. In capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne, the water authorities would call that their community consultation. They do it. And it's important that we begin to bring aspects of this into communities like Walgett and other, both remote and not remote, but our inland communities as well.
Thanks so much, Greg. Alinta, would you like to talk to us a bit now about your experience of being part of the survey team, and I guess what it helped you to understand about food and water insecurity in Walgett and the role of DEG and WAMS in this work?
Yeah, that's a huge question. But
sorry.
yeah, no, it was really good. It was a really good experience working with, two notable Aboriginal community organisations in Walgett. They're highly respected, and I think us aligning or working with them, the community acknowledged that, our purpose aligned with WAMS and DEG's. We originally put aside 3 weeks to do the surveys, and we've done them in 2, which was really good. But I think that reflected the eagerness of the community to, express their opinions on the issues of food and water. But yeah, it was really good. We got to really know the community. We got to become good friends with the survey team. They were great. Working with them really just made things run smoothly. Any little hiccup or hurdle that we had, they were all on it, resolved it quickly. Yeah, so that was my first time going to Walgett. My first time coming into contact with bore water. I grew up on the mid-north coast. I was spoilt for choice when it came to water and fish. But yeah, so it was a bit of a shock interacting with bore water for my first time. But yeah, I think, did I answer your question?
Yes, beautifully. Thank you. And it's actually segue to go and to hear from others in the survey team. We've got a short video from Trish Tonkin and Annie Dean, which Izzy is going to play now, which gives their perspective on that too.
Yama. My name's Trish Tonkin. I'm a Gamilaroi woman, born and raised in Walgett. I still live in Walgett part-time. I work for Dharriwaa Elders Group and I'm their Food and Water, the Life Program Officer.
I'm Annie Dean. I work for the Aboriginal Medical Service in Walgett. I live in Lightning Ridge, but I've been working in Walgett in different capacities for about 12 years. I'm also part of the survey team for the Food and Water for Life survey.
I think we needed to have the surveys, but one reason was because they didn't have any data, and how do you start making changes without data and being able to communicate with the people like government organisations, other organisations that can help out and make a difference. The only way we're going to make any changes at all is to get data, and the data is very, very important. And what came out of this survey was surprising. It was shock, but it wasn't. I wasn't shocked because I knew firsthand, as Annie would have known firsthand, that these people, there were a lot of people living in poverty in the place, and there's a lot of people in Walgett with chronic diseases that I think, this is my personal view, that I think that it comes from the water. It all stems back to the water, because there's a lot of, I grew up in Walgett. I was 9 years old when we moved up into Walgett, so there were 9 years of my life that I remember very well, going down the riverbank, seeing clear water, doing all the things that I wished that my grandchildren can do now, but they can't, because the water in the Walgett rivers aren't fit for anyone to swim in. The fish and yabbies and any river foods that come out of the river is not up to the standard it was when I was growing up.
So I think Trish and I were both surprised and impressed with how honest people were to us during the survey. So with the conversation, people were very generous in what they told us, the snapshot of the life they gave us, and the information was just much more personal.
Sometimes it was very, very confronting, because I am from Walgett, and we did do a lot of surveys with not just relations but with close friends that told me information that I didn't even know had existed in their families. And I appreciated everything that they told me, because we do want to make a lot of changes.
Yeah, so the surveys for that week in April that we set up were done in the local IGA car park, which is really the hub of the town, and that was a really good spot to be, because most people go to the supermarket most days. It's a busy little area in the town. Trish did much more than background work, let me assure you. She was very much part of the team, and you kept us going, and you kept the surveys coming, and you were instrumental in making sure everyone had everything. The car park was ideal in lots of ways, but it also was a place that I didn't realise that people would be so honest in. So we were sitting in a car park on plastic tables and chairs, and in that position, people were willing to tell us their life story. So the surprising amount of money that people in Walgett, one of the most vulnerable communities in our state, are spending on water, Although it still seems shocking, but we knew all this. Like none of this information is new. Water is a subject that's spoken about in Walgett a lot. Everyone's talking about the water, how bad it is, how expensive the food is. But to see it in black and white from that study was pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, people are spending, not were, people are spending $30 to $50 a week on water. I've been spending 30 to 50, actually closer to $50 a week on water just for my mum and I. So I go down every second day to get water in bottles so that I could take home so mum and I can drink water. But I can remember the days when I would come home from the pool and just stop off in someone's front yard and turn their hose on and drink water out of that hose.
A couple of people that I surveyed, they couldn't afford to buy water. So they were drinking the water, which is, for me, even sadder. So I don't know how they were doing it, but they were drinking that water because they couldn't afford to buy the water.
Yeah, Walgett water is smelly. It makes, when you have a shower, you just don't feel clean. You smell yourself for days and days after having a shower, and it's absolutely disgusting. I just don't know how people have put up with it for so long.
Or why?
And why, yeah. That's another thing too. Why have they put up with it for so long? Why hasn't something been done about this quite a few years ago? Why did we have to get to a stage where there's people that have chronic diseases like heart conditions, kidney diseases, all of those issues that people are dying from now, I think they relate back to water, and I've always thought that. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Oh, I definitely know the community feel the same way. So something I'm hearing a lot from people in my position is the quality of the water. So before these surveys were ever done, before it was even spoken about that we might be able to do something, people always spoke about the quality of the water, and also how expensive the food was, and what they would have to do to feed their family. You know, so the meals they'd have to skip, the cheaper food they'd have to buy to feed their family.
It's not right. I don't think city people would even consider having to go through all these things just to feed their families. City people would be up in arms about it years and years and years ago. We're hoping eventually that collecting all this data, we can start doing changes all over Australia, not just in Walgett. And that's the main aim, is to get things up and running so that we can make changes in the right direction, even if you have to take it back half a century, and get those changes made for a positive reason rather than something that, you know, people are just going to think, oh, you just want a pat on the back over it. I don't want a pat on the back. I want to see my grandchildren and my cousins and all of my relations, all of my friends in the community. I want them to be able to live a life that's healthy. And our motto in DEG and at WAMS is now good water, good food, good life. That's all I want out of this.
Extraordinarily powerful to hear from our wonderful colleagues, Trish and Annie there. And you would have heard, as well as the issues around the drinking water, them raising really important systemic issues around the state of the rivers. and responsibility for that, but also the affordability of fresh local food. So a number of systemic issues, and a lot of their work is informing advocacy that's happening on a national and state level, but it's also about community-led solutions. And Trish and Annie are both involved in a number of initiatives locally, building community-led responses to food and water security. So we might have to have another webinar. There's too much to cover there, but massive thanks to Trish and Annie for sharing that. What we thought we'd do with the rest of the time that we have available is to share some of the detail of the survey findings. And so I just wanted to talk those through a bit with you all. Essentially, the report on this is available on the DEG website and WAMS, and also via the UNSW website. But in terms of what we wanted to cover, I guess it's just giving you a bit of a snapshot of some of the highlights and hearing more from the panel from their perspective. But I guess in terms of overall findings, this is a pretty extraordinary one. Incredibly shocking, which is that community members reported many problems with food and water, including experiencing not having enough to eat or drink, or going to bed hungry and thirsty. So 46% of those surveyed experienced food insecurity, which is much higher than prevalence rates in previous national surveys in Australia, but similar to First Nations communities in Canada and many developing countries. 44% of those surveyed experienced water insecurity, which is similar to First Nations communities and worse than some communities elsewhere. And I wonder now if I can go to you first, Greg, and then you, Kez, to talk through some of these findings about water and then food security. Greg, can we start with you?
Yeah. So on the if we look at the numbers across the top, what you're looking at there is a water supply that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people agree on that is not really fit for purpose. The interruptions to supply, there's 3 communities in Walgett that were part of the survey. The people that live in the town just across the river in Namoy Village, which is connected to the main water supply, and then a satellite community at Gingee that's exclusively on groundwater. And so interruption to pumps, interruption to supply is part of that issue. Obviously that varies from part. Sorry. The second one is the $30 to $50 a week to bridge that gap, to go out and purchase water that's being shipped in, is in a plastic container. If you look at the sustainability of that, in addition to the impost it's placing on the disposable income of people, which is obviously the main problem there, that simply is not acceptable. Then what is the effect of that? And this is where the emotion gets in. This is where the expression of emotions and voice. 68% are angry about the situation, that the fact that the rivers are dry, that the water switches from town water to, from river water to town water, that we're just not delivering. There's a community here that is not being served. And that's, as a country, we can't claim to say we're meeting our commitments or our obligations to the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 6. And our colleagues at ANU have brought that out through other tools, but this brings it down. This gives it a very personal voice at a local level.
Thanks, Greg. Kez, did you have some reflections on the food security finding?
Sure, and I think it's important to see these two water and the food security findings together on the same slide here, because that's part of this message that we want to get across with this report as well. It's really focusing on that interconnectedness between the water and the food insecurity to get the full picture of what's happening in Walgett. So as we can see here, so around 2/3 of people surveyed said that they experienced food insecurity due to affordability, so not having enough money or food being too expensive. And 63% had issues with availability. So some of the things there were around there were no food on shelves due to depleted stocks and issues around disrupted supply chains. Accessibility was also an issue, with almost half of the people responding that they couldn't get to the shops to purchase food. So other issues included not having the required utilities such as power or equipment, such as having a fridge or an oven. However, those issues were experienced a little less frequently. And the survey also showed that when people experienced food insecurity, they primarily relied on extended family to provide food or money for food, fish or yabbies from the river, and donated grocery boxes. So yeah, as you can see, those drivers are really around the affordability, availability, accessibility, and the safety.
Thanks, Kez. And just briefly, this next slide outlines the source of food and water in the previous 12 months. And I noticed Alistair Sproul's question in the chat around rainwater tanks. You can see here that is a source of water. One of the findings that I think is really interesting to highlight here is that 29% of those surveys were getting fresh produce from WAMS community gardens. So massive shout out to everybody involved with providing that. And, you know, Annie plays a key role in that, but that's an extraordinary finding. Greg, was there some reflections on the water sources there that you had?
Yeah, so the town water supply supplied by the council serves the communities of Namoy and Walgett Town. Gingy is exclusively on the bore water. They have some tanks, they have the hydro panels. What that reflects on this is what we look at there we've got a diversified supply of water, which again is what the big water authorities in the capital cities are talking about. This is how they're investing to basically make their communities more resilient to drought, more resilient to climate change. And we have the capacity for all of those. As Alistair said, we can look at installing more rainwater tanks to capture the rainwater when it comes. We can look at, improved hydro panels that provide, small amounts of drinking water or water purely for drinking use. But more importantly, we've got to look at the big one is the town water supply, and that's that asset, that system is the one that has the greatest potential to be improved, by everyone coming together, working, at all levels of government to make sure that is fit for purpose.
Thanks, Greg. That's really important. And we'll return to that at the end if we have time to talk about next steps and advocacy in that area. Alinta, I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about which findings you feel like for this survey are really important for people listening in today to know about, and why.
Yeah, I think they're all important, but I think the biggest ones that shocked everyone was the water findings, and the fact that people are spending $30 to $50 a week on bottled water, which cuts into their food budgets. And there's also there's a trickle effect from the bore water as well. Greg mentioned people not willing to wash their clothes because there's a kind of an effect on the fabric. And that just creates another cost as well to replace those clothes. But yeah, I think this research continues the story of the rivers drying up. And yeah, I think it's not the best results, but it's a good place to start.
And that's exactly it, isn't it, Alinta, which is the idea to create a kind of baseline to be able to reflect back over time. And certainly we've seen in recent weeks the power of the survey results with community voices being featured in a range of media, and that having a really powerful effect. And we've already seen a swift response from the New South Wales Water Minister, who's visited Walgett, who's met with community stakeholders, who's announced that they are committed to improving the quality of water in Walgett and elsewhere. There's some early announcements around the switch to river water being a kind of short-term solution. But I suppose we know that that then turns attention to the state of the rivers. And there are many people, I think, joining this call today who would understand how that is such a massive systemic issue, and again, not just in Walgett. I wonder, in the time we've got left, whether or not we could talk through a little bit about next steps. So I mentioned Trish and Annie's work in Walgett around community activities, and there's some really interesting work happening there. The community garden there, expanding the capacity for that. New resources for kind of local activities. But I think this question here, if we can return to you, Greg, just briefly around greater capacity in the Shire Council and some options around that. And also, as you mentioned briefly before, the multiple levels of government that need to be engaged with this question around improving water.
Yeah, look, we can spend a lot of time talking about that, but I think briefly we need to reflect on, as again, from the water industry perspective. So the Water Institute looks at the water industry, which in the case of Walgett, you can't, because it's connected to everything else that we've discussed. But if we look at it from the industry perspective, we quite proudly partner with water authorities in other parts of the world to build their capacity. We're not doing it in our own backyard. There's tremendous opportunity there to work out ways to provide the people and the capacity that the council needs to improve the services. We sample the mains at different points in the houses for what are called taste and odour problems, compounds. And again, in our capital cities, that's dealt with by flushing the lines regularly. Now, that's just people and capacity to do that. Lots of simple solutions. The town has the capacity to fluoridate their water, but they don't have the operators to run the fluoridation system. And when we begin to look at the dental issues in the town, there's a big issue there with fluoridation. Until the basin, the northern basin, is managed in a different way that maintains flows for the towns, they're going to be switching back to bore water. As I mentioned, the community at Gingy are permanently on bore water. So there needs to be solutions, and part of it will be reverse osmosis. Maybe it'd be rainwater tanks, expanding hydro panels and other systems to service those communities. And again, that's a situation that's not unique to Walgett. Other communities are in that place as well. So that's the one where there's a lot of work.
Thanks so much, Greg. And anyone who might be interested in any particular aspect of the technical findings, of the survey findings, or any aspect of what we've discussed, please feel free to get in touch. I just would love now to briefly kind of give acknowledgements, particularly, as Eva mentioned, the work of the Dharriwaa Elders Group and the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service in leading this work. Some detail there around the people involved with this. But can I finally just ask the panel to reflect on what you hope the impact of this survey and of the Food and Water for Life project more generally will be? Kez, can we start with you, then Greg, and then Alinta to wrap us up?
Sure. I think there's a couple of things, but I'll keep it brief, noting the time. I just really hope that, besides the actual findings of the research that we're doing, that I hope that actually the way that we're working and the structure of the research team kind of provides a blueprint of best practice of how to do true community-led research well. I think that's a huge aspect of this work that should be highlighted and celebrated and shared. And I guess just the other thing is coming back to that point around better highlighting the holistic and interconnected association between water and food security, and better understanding the nuances of how they're related, and particularly for what that means for Aboriginal people.
Thanks so much, Kez. Greg?
I think the great hope is that non-Indigenous Australia can recognise and understand that Indigenous people have lived on rivers for 60,000 years and have sustained a life. So we're very much about sustainability. So the hope is that we begin to break down the silos and really think about how we allocate, share these resources, and that stretches from resources that we have here in Sydney going to Walgett, understanding how river water is allocated, just adopting a different way of managing our water supplies.
Thanks so much, Greg. And Alinta.
Final thoughts. Yeah, I have no doubt that things are going to get better in Walgett. From the first time I went there to the last time I went there, I think the community garden doubled in size. So that was really nice to see. But yeah, I'm going to echo what Kez said. I think this is a really good tool for other Aboriginal communities facing these issues to, reflect on and get some advice on how to go about creating change.
Thanks so much, Alinta. And thank you all for joining us today for the Yuwaya Ngarra-li webinar. As ever, please get in touch if you've got any questions or interest in our work. And thank you for joining us.